back, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're having a wonderful day today. So, I was recently asked in a live stream when was the first major crime committed here in the states and new colonies. Did we always have major crimes that were committed here? Is this a new phenomenon that is skyrocketing, now? Because if you watch the evening news, the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to lose faith in humanity, and you're going to lose faith in your country and the people around you. Crime has always been around. Crime has always been where people are. The very first murders actually took place way before we actually had settlements, before we had towns, before we had villages. The oldest crimes have been that where we can actually prove a crime happened, like murder, go back to the Neanderthals. We have found corpses in caves of people who were murdered. Their heads were crushed by rocks. So, going back now to America, the colonies. When did the first murder take place here? First capital crime? Did we have execution for that crime? And what are the circumstances around that? You may be surprised. So, September 14th, 1630, the first crime was reported in the new colonies here in America. The first murder was recorded in the history books, and the first public execution. John Billington, often confused with another individual, but John Billington was the first person to be tried and convicted of murder. He shot and killed John Newcomb. There's several different spellings in the history books on how you actually spell John Newcomb. But John Billington came to America on the Mayflower, along with his wife Eleanor, his son John Jr., and his son Francis. While on the ship, the Mayflower itself, the Mayflower almost never made it here. And that's a little bit of history that is still wrapped in controversy, but is definitely dependent. It doesn't matter which history book you read on the actual events. It's surprising that the Mayflower actually made it to America, because John Billington was originally charged with attempted mutiny on the boat, theft on the boat, and being a knave or scoundrel on the boat. All those charges were originally that he was charged with were dropped, but it was something that came up while on the boat. John Jr. almost blew up the Mayflower. Yes, you heard that right. He almost blew up the entire boat. What did he do? He discharged a musket pistol over the top of an open keg of black powder. If the muzzle flash would have ignited that black powder, it would have ignited the other black powder kegs that were next to it and would have blown up the Mayflower, and it would have sank. He discharged the pistol in the cabin quarters there on the ship because they were threatening to hogtie his father and then charge him with these crimes. Even though his father was not guilty of the crimes, it was more rumor and speculation that he committed the crimes, but there was no real evidence of it. And that's just the way our system was. Before we had laws and we had regulations and stuff like that, that gave, an accountability, and you had to bring forth evidence against someone. You can make up accusations against someone, and a lot of times they were found guilty of it before, ever putting up a defense. So when we go back through the history books, there is one individual who really disliked John Billington, and his family. The gentleman was William Bradford. Now, the Bradford family is still around to this very day. They have a very large family in the southern states. Go to like Mobile, Alabama. You can actually find the William Bradford's ancestry. But he was an ardent critic of him, and he made up a lot of lies about John, and he wrote letters back and forth to, and had them sent back overseas about different things that he saw that John was doing that were not necessarily part of the new order that they wanted to establish. His issue with John Billington and his family was, it started off first. William Bradford was a Puritan. John Billington was a Christian. And most likely he was a Catholic, and they did not like each other right off the bat. The Puritans and the Catholics never got along, and then coming over on the Mayflower, he probably found out that who he was on the Mayflower itself, on the ship, and didn't like who he was at all. In 1624, 1625, and 1626, he wrote several letters back to colleagues in the UK, saying that John Billington was a scoundrel, that he wouldn't follow orders, that he was basically a thorn in the side of the colonies. The Plymouth Records, that we have written records of, there were a lot of charges that were levied against men and women. Women in particular were often charged with fornication, but some of the other charges that were levied against people who were the first settlers in there, the colonies, were sexual charges, bestiality, rape, sodomy, and by 1690 they had pretty much started a witch hunt against anyone that they saw that wasn't part of the actual inner circle, basically. But John's was eventually hung after a very short trial, where almost no evidence was brought up, hearsay evidence, but he did admit to shooting John Newcomb. And yes, that did happen, and that is in the history books, that he did shoot him, and John Newcomb did die of his wounds. But what he left out in the history books, and that's something that needs to be make sure that is very clear, is William Bradford. When it came to the records from the Plymouth colonies, William Bradford and his inner close circle of friends, they wrote the history books. They kept the records. So it's a very one-sided accounting. But after his eventual trial and hanging for the first murder here in the colonies, Eleanor, his wife, was whipped, hogtied, locked away in the stocks, which is basically jail, and she was charged with fornication, and she was charged with a litany of other crimes, to the point where the family knew that they were being singled out. His granddaughter was also whipped and charged with fornication, and because they said she was fornicating with what would become her husband. So, again, the very first major crime here in America happened in September 14th, 1630.